Well, I'm certainly very pleased to be back here as well. It certainly makes a big difference from actually sitting in disciplinary meetings and grievances and all the sorts of things that I've been doing in the last couple of days. I'm going to stand if you don't mind, but I wanted to say just a few words really about Dave before I get started. I've only known Dave for a relatively short time. And I'm sure it is a short time when I look around the room and see people here, some of whom I know by your face, some of you I do actually know, maybe from other forums as well, but a lot of people who I know have a great deal of history with Dave. And indeed, Dave seems to have history with almost everyone and everything that is around this area. Well, yeah, we don't want to go into all of that. But I think, for me, I've known Dave really for about 5 years now, when he sort of captured me. When we were at a meeting, I think, talking about the health centre in Burnham, and persuaded me to come along and take part in what was going on here at the Trades Council through the Bridgwater and Taunton College UCU. So I've come from that direction. And one of the things that, of course, I've noticed about Dave all the time is that so many people actually rely on him to do different things. The most recent instance of that, of course, was the wonderful campaign that was actually held out at Street on behalf of our Clark's brothers and sisters. All right, and we have to recognise that one of Dave's great attributes is his commitment. I was going to list 3 things, and then I came up with another 2 as well. But I was going to talk about knowledge. I am going to say just something about that. I'm going to say something about discipline. But I'm certainly going to say something about commitment. And I think the people at Clark's, a lot of people who were actually involved in that dispute, a lot of people who attended on the picket line and so on, will know that a lot of that probably wouldn't have happened to the degree that it did. And I dare say it wouldn't have actually had the success that it did, certainly without the huge commitment of all the people who were involved in the picket line, but without the constant support and chivying and advice that must have come from Dave. I've heard that from everyone involved, including Trevor, who was actually sort of very much leading that whole campaign. And I think that was certainly true when we were involved in a strike at Bridgwater and Taunton College. 1 or 2 of you might even have seen a picture of me standing haranguing a CWU driver who actually came up with a special delivery from Exeter, and Dave sort of nudged me in the ribs and told me to go and have a word with him, and we sent him back to Exeter, which was great for me. It's been a wonderful lesson actually for the rest of the UCU. I mention it very often at conferences and when we're actually talking about actions that might take place. Remember that if you're going on a picket line, remember to picket. And I think I learned that from Dave. So I think in so many aspects of life in Bridgwater, Dave has demonstrated his commitment, whether it's been to obviously the Trades Council, but all of the other organisations that he's been involved in, including some unlikely ones. I was quite surprised when he originally mentioned to me that he was actually helping to look after the Civic Society, who I see as a different sort of group of people altogether. But I think that's probably Dave all over. He's full of secrets. But I did want to say something about the knowledgeable way that he actually approaches everything. Dave is, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Dave, but Dave is very, very humble in this way. This will probably be quite a surprise to some of you as well. All right, but I think you are very self-deprecating in many ways, Dave. You don't see yourself necessarily as an academic or as a great author, and yet, nevertheless, you're accepted and respected by people who are in all of those communities. Certainly, Bristol University, I know there are people there who have an enormous amount of respect for you, not just on the picket line, but also in the archives and the library as well. I know there are other people in the Writers Guild, for example, now, whom you're now a member, I know, who obviously recognise not only your talent, but your disciplines, I was going to say, in being able to actually produce so many of the things that you have been working on over the years. And I think I remember watching a video recently of John actually talking about your daily discipline in terms of writing and so on. And I'm quite sure that Dave does much the same thing in terms of getting down to work pretty much the same time every day, every week and so on. And no doubt as a result of that, being able to actually publish these magnificent volumes. Glen is probably going to tell me in a minute it's nothing like that, but that's my way of looking at it. That's what I imagine happens. That's in a sense of sort of fantasy really of someone who actually manages to come up with the goods time and time again. So very knowledgeable about so many different things. I remember going to Dave once and asking something about socialism. I think I was asking him am I wrong to be worried about whether I'm working class enough? And quite honestly, it hit me with so many things from so many years ago that I came away thinking, no, everything was fine because Dave says so. He's got lots and lots of facts to his fingertips as far as that's concerned. I think it's inevitable that anybody who's come across Dave in any of these contexts, whether it's the CWU, whether it's the Trades Council, whether it's the Civic Society, whether it's the TUC, whether it's Mendip Trades Council, taken off again, very much as a result of Dave's initiative and hard work and again commitment. All of those people would recognise that Dave has been a real driving force for those. But he also has a lot of other charming attributes about him as well. I phoned him up the other day because I wanted to have a chat. He said, I'm sorry, I'm not here at the moment. I'm on a cycling tour of South Wales. Right, okay, so I know that's what Dave does, and I know he's been very eager to get me out on the bike recently, but as you can see he hasn't quite managed it yet. Nevertheless, we will get there during the summer, I'm sure. But certainly I've said he's very disciplined. We know that he has written in a very entertaining way, really, about his own history and the history of so many organisations that he's belonged to. He is a great storyteller. And I think that comes across in these books, and it also comes across when he's actually speaking. No doubt we're going to get a real earful of it in a moment as well. I was not complaining the other day, I was remarking that when we had our Trades Council meeting the other day, we had another comrade with us, again from the CWU, and I wonder why it is that people from the CWU have all the great stories. I'm hoping that other trade union comrades will actually come up with equally good stories so that we can actually put together perhaps a tome full of trade unionist tall tales. But the last thing I really wanted to say about Dave, I think, and as I've said already, I haven't known him for that long. I think it's about 5-6 years coming up, something like that. But I think Dave has not only a great commitment to organisations, a great commitment to history, a great commitment to the truth, but you also have, Dave, a huge commitment to people and individuals as well. And I'm very struck by the way, really, when I've found myself in trouble from time to time, Dave's been there, giving me a helping hand and support and so on as well. So I really value your friendship, Dave, and I'm really honoured that you allowed me to come here and chair this meeting tonight. Thanks very much, Dave.
Didn't know that was going to happen, so thanks to my friend John for that. But for me, this meeting is about Bridgwater. This meeting is about people, there's half a dozen people from Bristol here, fantastic to see you. Normally Bristol people have only ever come to Bridgwater for the splash, and of course now the splash is demolished, we never see Bristol people in Bridgwater, so absolutely brilliant, you've broken the mould. Bristol people coming to Bridgwater, absolutely fantastic. So this meeting for me is about Bridgwater. The book I wrote is my tribute to Bridgwater. And this meeting I want to be a meeting full of people's stories about Bridgwater. We've been here longer than I have. I'm a Clevedonian. I'm from Ackerbill country. I'm from Adge Cutler country. I had my first pint of rough in 1966, just before Adge cut his first live LP in the Royal Oak in Nailsea. And I worked with Drink Company Cider George's sister as a cleaner in Gordanium School. And if Drink Company Cider George was a character, you should have met his wife. Christ, was she militant? She was the most militant school cleaner I ever had the honour to be a shop steward for. But look, so this meeting is for me about Bridgwater. So I only came to Bridgwater in 1987, so I'm a relative stranger. And every single one on the top table have been in Bridgwater longer than I have. Brian was born here, and all of the other guest speakers apart from John.
Every time you say I was born here.
Well, you more or less.
Not long after, but you know.
Yes, I made a mistake, but you're not going to hear the truth. Because this is about the truth. History is supposed to be about the truth. How long after you was born in Leeds did you come to Bridgwater, Brian?
Well, about a year.
So, this is an opportunity for people to tell you stories. And it's great that some veterans are here, not just the people on the top table. I'm also very proud of the fact that after us members of the Civic Society are here. Absolutely brilliant to see members of the Civic Society here at Bridgwater History event. So, brilliant to see you, Rob. Rob Clark, one of the survivors of the employment training scheme, one of the first strikes against Thatcher's youth unemployment scheme in the late 80s. Brilliant to see Pete Hicks here, veteran firefighter, veteran of some of the strikes in the fire brigade. Absolutely brilliant to see Alan Herford here. He would want at this point to actually go on and on and on and on and on and on and on about his time as town clerk. I'm not even going to mention that, but perhaps the best centre half Bridgwater town ever had, Alan Herford. So,
I'll take the second one then.
So my 5 minutes or so left, I just want to talk about the Somerset Clarion, because this all came out of the miners' strike. And the last tribute I want to make is to Dave Lockett, because if you look at that magnificent banner over there, and do have a good look at it, it's a Somerset banner rather than a Bridgwater banner. But it came as a result of all of us wanting to try and make the miners win. In 1984-85, because they were defending communities, and hence the word community. And this journal, the Somerset Clarion, came out of that. And this is recent history, isn't it? But it is history. I mean, I suppose history is anything that happened yesterday or even last year. And I think it's really important to think about the past and to talk about the past, not just from personal memories, but to try and make sense of it, even if it's only 20 or 30 years ago. So that was the longest surviving miners' support group after the miners' strike. I believe that's correct, other than the Justice for Sacked Miners campaign. That campaign, which was based in Bridgwater, it was based in the Labour Party headquarters in Bridgwater, lasted for the best part of 10 years. Which, when you remember that the miners' strike was defeated, it was a very bitter defeat. The old mining communities now are wastelands, where you work for a minimum wage in a flipping warehouse, and drugs and crime are out of control. That's your typical, where Ken, who just spoke to, Ken from Sunderland, is a good example. Steel fixers are getting £25 an hour in Hinkley Point, and they come from Sunderland, and they spoke to me. They said, Dave, if I went back to Sunderland, I wouldn't even get £10 an hour as a steel fixer. So they're devastated communities, and we stood by the miners, and despite the fact they were defeated, their enthusiasm, hi Hillary, their enthusiasm was such that it infected us, and we kept going until we people may disagree, but I think we burnt ourselves out sometime in the mid-1990s. But so there's the banner. We met in Unity House, and we produced this journal called the Somerset Clarion, which lasted longer than the Defence campaign. It lasted right through to 1999. It was the longest surviving local trade union-based community defence magazine. The first issue was a prototype, much to Brian's disgust. I wrote it out by hand, long before computers. Then Brian took over the editorship for about 10 or a dozen issues, and then I took over the editorship. But just about everybody here and some other people in the audience were involved in that, and we took up every single campaign we could. Nuclear power was a big issue. There were a lot of fears at the time of stuff going on at Hinkley Point, and for some people still are. So that's Hinkley Point Power Station fault welding cover-up. Dave Hanna, who I was hoping would be here tonight, who was also very important in the defence campaign, uncovered a whole load of semi-secret stuff involving somebody who was actually quite well respected by a lot of working class people, Tom King, who's in the House of Lords now, even though he's a Conservative MP in basically a Labour town. And by the way, if anybody doesn't know, Brian is now the leader of the only Labour town council in the southwest, Bridgwater. Okay. But Tom King, now Lord King, was complicit in the cover-up of shoot-to-kill operations against nationalists in Northern Ireland by the British Army. Absolutely no doubt about that. And the Somerset, Clarion and Dave Hanna were instrumental in that. We tried to link up with all sorts of people. I've never called myself an anarchist, but then and now, a lot of sincere anarchists also passionately pro-animal, passionately anti-hunting, and passionate about all sorts of things. And so this is a march we helped to organise. The Class War, remember the Class War Journal, anybody?
Yes.
Yeah, quite a punchy journal, wasn't it? Class War Rural Revolt, Reclaiming Our Land, and that was a march through the lanes near Yeovil, which the police tried to ban. We were opposed to wars, in particular the wars in the Gulf. And that wasn't a popular thing to do, both in 1990 and in 2003. Maybe less popular in 1990. I remember, I think we got 60 or 70 to march through the town. Brian was there, Glen was there, other people here were there. Wasn't easy. People didn't understand that. People felt that Saddam Hussein should be taken out, even if it wasn't our business. We supported workers. We supported the ambulance workers. Animal rights, a socialist cause. This is topical, isn't it? Mental health crisis. This is November 1989. The mental health crisis now is worse than it's ever been. Some of us are trying to stop the closure of Mick's only mental health ward, St Andrews and Wells. They want to expect people in a mental health crisis and their families to go to Yeovil. Ever tried catching a bus between Wells and Yeovil? On a Sunday it takes 7 hours there and back. We supported unions, and I love this photograph. It's a photograph of the second 7 crossing. That was an all-out strike, which was victorious in the end. They sacked all the workers, a bit like Hinkley Point. How many people know that within the last 4 weeks, the largest unofficial strike in Great Britain in the last 40 years happened down the road? It's all been hush-hush. 2,000 to 3,000, mostly men, stopped work, occupied the canteen, and won every single thing that they demanded, even though it was unofficial and illegal. We were passionate anti-racists. So those are Asian women who were cleaners at Hillingdon Hospital. And they were on strike for 4 years. They were so determined to get better pay that even when their union deserted them, and I'm not here and John's not here to say that everything in the trade union movement is rosy, far from it. We carried on supporting them. They're some of the bravest women I've ever met. And some of the goings on with the police and quite recently in Bristol. So you can see the range of stuff that we covered. That was the Somerset Defence campaign. It couldn't have happened without Bridgwater. It couldn't have happened without the Labour Party in Unity House. And I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but I do regret that the Labour Party doesn't have a headquarters. And I don't know if Brian has still got any hopes for that. And maybe during the discussion later we can talk about that. But I think, John, I want to said something about something that's very dear to my heart, the Somerset Clarion, which Brian and I edited. You know, that banner, defending the miners, they defended their communities, why can't we defend our communities? And it's more relevant now than ever. But for me, actually, this whole thing about Dave Chapple in the book, I do hope you buy it. There's 2 for 15 tenner, 2 for 15 quid, 3 for 30 quid.
Well, stop giving it away.
Okay, and I've given away a few, and there's a few other books. I couldn't have published them without the support of my union. So those 5 books I've written and published in the last 2 years, I got 3,000 quid off my union, the General Secretary's Department for that. I couldn't have done them without the support of Nigel Costley of the South West TUC, who designed them, made them look professional. I think probably about 4,000 quid worth of work he did for free. So whatever you think of the text, because it's basically, I like doing books that are picture books really. Picture books with commentary. The commentary is mine. Any fault with the commentary, come and see me. But you can't fault the layout because Nigel Costley is a beautiful professional. So for me, this is about Bridgwater. This is about the chance for you, even if you can't remember the 80s, to think about what it means to you to grow up in Bridgwater, what makes Bridgwater special. Because I'm a stranger. For me, the day I came to Bridgwater to live with Glen Burrows was the best day of my life. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Dave.
All right.
You get your own back in a minute. Right, what I'm going to do is to go down the table. We've got Polly here, Mick, Brian and Glen. And Brian assures me that if we go in that order, we'll get stories which actually go in a chronological order as well. Now, of course, me being even more of a stranger, I mean the real stranger, I think, here, all of this is going to be very, very new for me, but a lot of you will, I'm sure, be wallowing in a certain amount of nostalgia because you'll be reliving some of the things that these people are going to say. So, without my wittering on about it, Polly, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind leading off. Thank you very much indeed.
I need my support system here. Okay, great. Polly Lerry. I've been asked here tonight, thank you Dave for asking me to come along and talk about the Star March. Give me a time to remember it. And for featuring the Star March in your book. I'm really pleased to see that. I'm really glad that this hasn't been forgotten, because I suspect that a lot of it is somewhere in the ether, on the back burner, which is a shame. So what was the Somerset Star March? It was a number of national anti-nuclear women's protest marches that converged at Greenham Common on Hiroshima Day in August the 6th, 1983. So you can work it out. Somebody mentioned about 20, 30 years ago. Well, this is now 40 years ago. And just to put that into a bit of context, in 1981, 4 women from West Wales, concerned about the nuclear threat, organised a peaceful protest march from Cardiff to Greenham Common in Berkshire. These are young women with families. In 1980, many of you know, the RAF Greenham was selected to be one of 2 British bases to house cruise missiles. The other one was Molesworth. Am I right? A peace camp was established at Greenham, which became the focus for mass protest and demonstration. The women called themselves Women for Life on Earth. Their intention, it was a women's protest, but the intention wasn't to exclude men, it's just the women wanted a voice. My involvement was I had a friend who was on that first walk for peace. And the following year in 1982, I was asked to join another peace march which went from Cardiff to RAF Brawdy in Pembrokeshire. Brawdy was an American tracking system station, which was at the time thought to be a prime target for a nuclear attack. And then in 1983, so following on from that, in 1983, I was contacted by Annie Tunnicliffe, who I walked with on the Brawdy March, to ask if I would consider organising a march from my area, Bridgwater in Somerset, as part of something called the Star March Initiative. The aim was that around 25 marches would start from various points around the country to arrive at Greenham for Hiroshima Day on the 6th of August 1983. I was at that time a member of Bridgwater CND and, as now, a member of the Labour Party. I can't honestly remember, Glen, how I went about it. I'm not saying Glen because Glen was there. But women and men from both CND and the Labour Party became involved, Bridgwater CND, Bridgwater Labour Party. Some are in the audience tonight. One is in the audience. No, two are in the audience tonight. Anybody else? No? And together we planned and mapped our route, indeed going out, visiting the route, making sure that it was safe for people to walk, planning places where we were going to stay. It was going to start on July 23rd, 1983 from Taunton, and it would take 13 days. And we walked on average about 10 miles a day. Our first night from Taunton to Bridgwater, and the first night was spent bivouacking in Unity House. But we mainly camped at our destinations, and we were supported by local groups and sympathisers. When I say supported, they found places for us to stay, they fed us. It was a joint activity, but it was amazing the way in which we were supported at that time by people. We did have a van to help us en route, lent to us from Dave from Watchet. I don't remember who Dave was, but Mick assures me it was Dave from Watchet, who was a Labour Party member. We relied on donations to support us financially, and I don't, you can help me here, Glen. The Labour Party, women's group of the Labour Party, don't remember. CND, and definitely the T&G helped us. And I know they helped us with admin with printing, but I also think they helped us with finances too. But we did collect help donations en route as well to help us finance this, because none of us had any money. The spirit of the march remained as peaceful protests, because that was the ethos of Women for Life on Earth. And we aimed to engage with people along the way and share our concerns. We carried our banners, sang, juggled, leafleted without being intimidating, and we also had a sit-in outside Porton Down, because Porton Down was one of the places we stayed at en route. And I can't remember during that time ever being received badly by the people that we met along the way. We arrived at Greenham on the 5th of August, and the next day joined the moving commemoration of Hiroshima Day, and with groups of women, or people, generally men, women, children, floating candles down the River Kennet. In November 1983, 96 cruise missiles arrived at Greenham Common. 3 weeks later, 50,000 women encircled the base in protest. Just think about it. 4 women started the walk for peace from Greenham Common. And here we have 50,000 women, people, because I think men and women, children joined together to formulate this protest. In 1991, cruise missiles were eventually removed from Greenham Common, and that was in light of the Reykjavik summit that happened between Reagan and Gorbachev. I have read, apparently, Greenham Common women's protest did influence Gorbachev's decision to go to Reykjavik. I've also read that the protests were not influential at all. I've also read that one of the intervention of Thatcher played a key role in this as well. So the history of it, of the outcome, is varied. This peace camp continued for 19 years as a continuing voice of protest, and the last of the women left in 2000. And I can only say that I'm just privileged to have been a part of that at that time.
it's my intention, everyone, as long as everyone's okay with this, to ask all of our speakers to speak first. And then if there is anybody who either wants to contradict everything that they've heard, or perhaps ask questions, or indeed tell their own stories, then we'll come to the floor after that. I hope that's okay with everyone.
Oh, I wanted to say something else.
So, right, best laid plans.
Am I allowed to do this?
Of course.
Right. I can honestly say that I don't think I've unwrapped this. I might have done, so I might be telling a fib. But this is the banner that we had for, do you want to give me?
Yeah.
All the time. The Star March. That's our...
Has it been in that bag ever since?
Sorry. Yes. Am I at it? Am I not?
Lovely, thank you. You probably need to use it as a tablecloth or something, don't you? Get it out more often. Right.
So I don't
Oh, so that people see it all the
I
time.
think women are that.
All right, I'm not going to go there. Right, anyway, I should realise that I was just digging myself further into a hole. So what I'm going to do next is come to Mick. Mick, I think, is going to talk to us about teachers' strikes. Now, of course, I was also an NUT member many years ago, and my only real experience of a teachers' strike round about that time was, I think, in 1980, possibly 1980 or 1981. I was in Durham at the time, and I took part in, as far as I know, the only teachers' strike which was a joint strike between the NUT and the NAS-UWT, because there was always an interesting tension between those two unions in those days. But I know nothing about what Mick is going to tell us. No doubt some of you will know all about it.
Well, to start off with, I wasn't born in Bridgwater, but I was born in Bridgend, so it's pretty close, right? And you know, as somebody who actually left school at 15, went to work first on a farm and then into engineering, it was while I was in engineering that I realised I actually wanted to pick up my education again. And it was my trade union that helped me at that time. I went to a place called Colleague Harlech, which unfortunately is closed now. But it was for students for a second chance. If somehow you missed out on your education, this was the place that you could go to. And there was money within LEAs at that time for adult education as well. So I went on to Colleague Harlech and eventually on to Swansea University, and then later trained as a teacher. So I owed a great deal to my trade union to help me into education. And that was, you know, very valuable to me in terms of shaping my whole sort of career as well. And one of the things, when I was at Swansea, one of the major projects developing at that time, and Dave sort of touched on this in his book, reminds me of this as well, was a project where we were bringing in to Swansea all the books that belonged in the miners' libraries. The miners' libraries where they used to go, where they used to actually learn their politics, where they used to shape their mind about their trade unionism. All those books were coming in to Swansea to be part of the major library, because many of those places were closing down. And the NUM at the time did a huge oral history of the valleys as well and the mining areas to actually keep that sort of record of that time, that industry, and the people around it as well. So it's an amazing sort of work that went on with the trade union as well. And it's important for them to remember what they went through, but also kept it alive, sort of communities at that particular time. Now, as Dave was saying, destroyed by the loss of that sort of industry within that area. So when I came eventually to Bridgwater, I came in 1976, And at that particular time, in 1974, there'd been the sort of move to comprehensive education, which was the LEA decided on that, because the LEAs had that control then within education. There'd already previous to that been the raising of the school leaving age, and therefore there'd been this huge population that was within our schools, within the Bridgwater schools, but elsewhere as well. And it was coping with that raising of the school leaving age and coping with that sort of change in comprehensive education as well. When I came to Blake School to work, 14 other teachers started with me, because there was just a need then, because the schools had developed, they were much larger than they had been previously. So there was that move that went on. So in 1976 when I arrived, people spoke to me about what was then known as the Houghton Report. And that's when all of a sudden teachers got this massive pay rise, partly because they were needed, because of the raising of the school leaving age, but also simply because of the move into comprehensive education as well. That pay rise was 30%. It was huge. People talked about it as the purple period in teaching. But already at that time, there were 15% less teachers going into training. A huge reduction in the number of teachers going into the training when you consider those who would be coming out as well. With inflation during the 70s, very similar to what we've got now, and experiencing, with that inflation, that 30% soon disappeared. And therefore the campaigns were developing. And you know, what happened with myself is that I soon found, not only was I school rep in my school, but I was also became the branch secretary for Bridgwater. And it was about what were we going to do within our sort of campaign on pay. Conferences decided that, and we were going into a time when we had to really test the membership to see if they were really quite angry, but also that they were also prepared to take that action, because it wasn't always easy to actually take teachers out on action. And what happened was that during this particular time, we were able to actually spend some time trying to develop the campaign. And the campaign was developed by, sometimes we would go into a school and the school reps would say that a number of teachers, all in teaching unions, were going to take an hour out of the day. An hour out of the day. And what happened was those schools had to close. But the teachers only lost 1 hour of pay. And while we were doing that, obviously, eventually the government were getting wise to the sort of campaigns that we were running in terms of trying to make sure that we had the support of our membership. It came to whereby we were going to have rolling rallies, and those rolling rallies were going to be in the morning. We were going to go back to school in the afternoon. So, you know, we lost a morning's pay, but we were in a position whereby we were back at work in the afternoon. And that was part of the campaign, because we knew that what it would do would close schools. And it was difficult for teachers, you know, knowing that there would be pupils who would actually not be able to go to school. But it was a campaign that they felt they had to do in order to make sure that people were paid properly and that we could encourage more people into teaching as well. What eventually happened was that a rolling rally was going to happen in Somerset. And they came up to me and they said, look, Mick, where are we going to have this rally? And I said, let's have it in Bridgwater. Let's have it in Bridgwater. And at that time, we didn't even know the number of people who would be coming out on strike on that day. So when we went to organise it, we went to the town hall. Alan wasn't there then. We might have been there, Alan. We went to the town hall and we said, this is the place where we can have the strike, because we could probably get 500 people in here if we need to, even if they're standing. And then we will march through town to Cranley Gardens. So we had to see the police and everything else. The police were saying, how many people are going to happen in this march? How many people? Well, at that time, we weren't sure, but we said, we think it's going to be 400 to 500. And we were lucky in that sense that we did have that support, because 500 people were in the town hall on that day, and we had a brilliant speaker. His name was Don Winters. He was the treasurer, national treasurer, but he was also the national president. But he was a fantastic speaker. Came from Newcastle, was a head teacher in a primary school there, came down and he spoke to the people there, the teachers there. And the BBC were in there filming and everything. And I remember the reporter saying, he is a fantastic speaker, and he was. And as he was finishing, the crowd, the teachers on strike were rising to their feet to applaud him. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then we got outside. Now, one of the things we had to think about in having this rally was we didn't have a banner, so we had to make a banner. We had to get stewards all together in order to make sure that we could actually march through Bridgwater and end up at Clarion Gardens, because we had to show that we were organised, and the police demanded that from us as well. That went on that day, and I used to see Don Winters afterwards, even probably 10, 15 years later, and he always spoke to me about the day he came to Bridgwater. Yeah, fantastic. But anyway, what happened is that in taking that action, we followed on, and eventually we had what was known as the Clegg report. The Clegg decided on a pay increase. So it was a phased increase. It went on for some time. We carried on campaigning, and eventually, by the end of the 80s, we actually had the teachers' pay commission, and that was really bringing an end to our negotiations, because the NUT used to negotiate in Burnham for pay and on the Burgundy book for pay and for conditions of service. We always liked the separation, because you couldn't sell your conditions of service for pay, and you couldn't give your pay away for conditions of service, and we quite liked that. Now it's all been brought together under the pay commission document. And therefore what happens is that we actually, as a union, have to submit our evidence. Civil servants from the Department of Education submit their evidence, and other unions submit their evidence, and eventually we get an award out of that. So that whole process of negotiation, with the LEA on conditions of service has gone completely. And nationally, we are controlled now. One of the good things about it is that teachers still get national pay awards, and their pay is the same whether you're working in Newcastle or in Cornwall, and that is a good thing. It's different in London because you get the London allowance and so forth. But the public sector had always taken, if you like, the cut, always taken the austerity with any government to actually move down. But in terms of developing that it was all the teachers in Somerset came to Bridgwater on that particular rally. It was an important rally. We had others. We had others in the rugby ground in Bridgwater. We had others down in Taunton and elsewhere. But it was the first major rally that we'd had during a time when there were lots of, if you like, action being taken by activists within trade unions throughout the country during the 70s and then into the 80s as well. So it is that Dave has put in to his book on Bridgwater, that oral history of that time, and there are many other accounts, whether it's the Star March and others that you will be talking about tonight, that shows that history is there, that radicalism is there. And I can always remember people saying it would be far better if we could actually have it in Bridgwater. And I know that the schools in Bridgwater as well were always willing to take action. In fact, it became a bone of contention that sometimes when I said it's the turn of Yeovil, they've got to take their action. And they struggled with it. And they said, can we come back to Bridgwater? And I said, we've got to make sure that our action is fair on all the schools and for activists within the county. So that's the sort of part of that story which I was part of. Eventually, I became divisional secretary and national executive member. I've always known Glen for a long time. Glen was on the Star March as well, and so I met Glen then. So it is, to me, something that is always memorable in my sort of part within the trade union movement within Bridgwater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mick. It's interesting what you're saying about the way that education has moved on. Of course, we now have a town in Bridgwater where most of the schools, not all of them, but most of the schools are run by a school from Clevedon. It's actually the school that I used to teach in, strangely enough, but nowadays, of course, it controls so much that we have in Bridgwater. And of course, that's all controlled through academies. We probably didn't get you onto academies, didn't we, Mick? But for me, I'm afraid academies are the work of the devil. I would say a lot more about it if I had the opportunity. However, all of these different things that we have had, actually, we've been hearing about, have all been started up by local people and so on. And I know that when I actually want to find out about what's going in Bridgwater, there's one place that I always go to, and that's of course the house where Dave and Glen live. So you've heard a certain amount, from Dave, but now we're able to hear the real story. If I go to Glen now, so over to you, Glen. I beg your pardon.
But you can carry on doing it, it's okay.
Right, okay, I'm just going down the table, aren't I? Would you like to go to Brian first? Right, strike everything I've just said. And we'll go to Brian first, if you don't mind, because I think Glen is probably going to round things up in a nice way as well. No, we'll go to Brian first. Over to you, Brian, because you've got a great deal to say about a whole variety of different things. Again, I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of this. Thanks very much. But you're not going on the piano tonight, are you?
Is the one here? Thank you, John. So, following on from what Mick said earlier on, I absolutely confirm there's nobody on this top table that was born in Bridgwater. And we're talking about Bridgwater history tonight. But I was born in Leeds. I moved to Bridgwater at a very early age and didn't stay here very long. Moved around the country with a power station, lived in North Wales for most of my childhood. Came back in the 70s. Been here ever since. 1986, we're talking about, some 36 years ago now. I'd only just left school at the time, I seem to remember. And I wasn't even in the Labour Party at the time. I was working for a company called Multi-Freight, which was a multi-drop delivery company at the time. And I'd just been sacked from them for wearing a James Connolly badge for delivering to a nuclear power station, which wasn't the real reason they sacked me. They really sacked me because I tried to organise a trade union amongst them. And I was straight out after that. But it was the year 86 was an important year for me in a sense, because it was also the year that I discovered that I was half Irish. I didn't realise that during my childhood. I discovered that my dad was from Ireland. So I learnt all the stuff being brought up a Catholic. I was very keen on finding out about that. I read all the Republican history, went over to see my family, and they were all orange Protestants and Unionists. It was a bit of a disappointment for me, but didn't spoil the next year ahead, because the bit I'm going to talk about tonight was when a bit of orange Ulster came to Bridgwater in November the 15th, 1986. The Friends of British Ulster, who you can hardly find a mention of on any website these days. And I say website, all this stuff here wasn't done on computers, that was done on electric typewriters and Tipex. Apart from Dave's, which was done handwritten on it. But by the time I was editing the Sheep Were In magazine, which looked a bit like that, and that's why Dave got me in to try and make that look a bit like a fanzine. Friends of British Ulster was a group that came out of the Hillsborough Agreement, the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. What they was a very early attempt to bring the problems in Northern Ireland to a head by getting the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland to cooperate a little bit on the issues of the North. And that's the first time that actually happened. Gareth Fitzgerald, the Prime Minister of Ireland, it was Thatcher who was the Prime Minister over here, and of course Tom King was the Northern Ireland Secretary at the time. That's what made the connection to Bridgwater. And they brought in this thing, and all it said was the Dublin government could be a consultee at Hillsborough in some discussions about the future of Northern Ireland. That was absolutely quite reasonable and not much different to what eventually happened. That brought a kind of a peace to Northern Ireland that we have now. At the time, the Protestants, the Unionists, the Loyalists, the Paisleyites went bonkers. Doesn't take much of them to go bonkers, but they went absolutely bonkers at this thing. They really didn't want that to happen. They saw that as the slippery slope to United Ireland. So they organised all sorts of, with extreme right-wing backing, groups to maintain the Union and to oppose that. And one of the groups set up was a group called Ulster Resistance, which was a paramilitary group that included things like incursions over the Irish border, armed incursions and so on like that. But mainly, there was an opportunity for British fascist groups like the National Front at the time, British movements and so on like that, to try to increase their membership by latching on to that issue. Because it can be quite a popular issue. If you're putting up posters saying hang the IRA, that can be quite a popular issue among certain quarters. And that's what they were doing. Right? And round about November, they decided they were going to make a big demonstration in Bridgwater. So they come to Bridgwater, the home of Tom King, to teach the people of Bridgwater a lesson for supporting this awful attempt at United Ireland, which was literally nothing of the sort. Even Jeremy Corbyn opposed it, by the way, at the time. Corbyn opposed the Anglo-Irish Agreement, as did Tony Benn and Ken Livingstone and others. But from the right of the Anglo-Irish Protestant Loyalist point of view, it was the slippery slope. We heard on the 1st of November that year, a fellow called Brian Green, Reverend Brian Green, a Baptist minister from London, was going to organise this demo. A little bit of research with the help of Searchlight, the anti-fascist organisation, discovered that the Reverend Brian Green was a National Front candidate back in Islington. And if you look at some of his posters to this day, they're pretty appalling. He only died in 2017, I discovered recently, but at the time he was Paisley's best mate in London. When Paisley came to London, he'd stay with Brian Green. There's quite a lot of other well-known fascists that were latched onto this. But they also had lots of Ulster exile groups around from places like Corby, places like Liverpool and that, where they all came down to, and they all came in the uniforms, the marching bands, the lambic drums and all this to the town. So we knew that there was a fascist element to this, that they were going to exploit this situation. So we thought we'd try to organise a counter-demonstration, what we call a picket. We organised a picket. So there's a bit of debate locally about whether we could get the thing banned. Second District Council didn't really want to ban it. They decided they couldn't do that, couldn't stop. A bit more concerned about whether the shoppers would go to Taunton that day rather than fascist marches in the town. But we asked for people around the southwest to come and support us. And on the day, we had about 100 people got to Unity House that morning. I remember anarchists from Plymouth coming up, people down from Bristol, some local Labour Party members came along as well. What we didn't realise was there was 400 of these Ulster Loyalists that turned up in 6 coaches and a load of minibuses down the Bristol Road, packed up at Castlefields. I don't know whether Bridgwater were playing that day, they might have been. Big crowd. Yeah. And so we wondered what to do about that, and we were going to go out to meet. I remember the first words Dave said was, right, Smedley, Mark. So I had to lead him out of the building, wondering where we were going to go with this one. And I made a really catastrophic mistake of suggesting we divide what we had with this minuscule force. We put one at the town bridge, we put the other at the Eastover crossroads. in the theory that when they passed the first one, they'd be between the two of our groups like that. But if you just remember, that's 400 to 1. A bit like saying, come on, Custer, let's surround those Indians, you know. So that didn't go down terribly well. And when you get to the Eastover Crossroads, looking up Mumba Street, where they were coming, it was like, obviously, one of the Northern Irish parades you see with the uniforms, the drums, the flutes playing, and all this. And the police had taken it seriously. They put on 4 people that day. And they stationed one bike, it was called Clifton Lighting at the time, on the corner. And the others were watching the anarchist group where Glen and Dave were, back at the town bridge. In them days, the precinct, the pedestrianisation had only just started. And there's like a metal gate, a barrier sort of thing there, which separated the pedestrianisation from the town bridge. They were standing there with a little banner saying no Nazis. They were wrong, of course. There was lots coming their way. So when they got to the Eastover Crossroads, they just launched straight into people in a rather violent way. Several people were hit and injured, and so, but their stewards calmed them down because there were more people they could hit further up the road. So they carried on up there, and we were like recovering a little bit from the Eastover Crossroads thing. And then, because I wasn't there by the time they'd hit what we might call the forlorn hope on the town bridge, and I believe they just ran straight into the crowd of people at the town bridge. That's the view of the town bridge, by the way, of that day. Yeah. And the police at that point arrested a couple of people. One of them was the National Front candidate for Mid-Staff's by-election that happened a bit later. He was pictured in that magazine as well. And we then caught up with them. Marched, carried on around town. They were charmingly shouting Fenian scum at everybody. Or if there's any women around, they'd call them lesbian Fenian scum. Which is also, obviously designed to hurt, but didn't really. And then they marched around the town, came back over the town bridge for a second go. By this time, the people of Bridgwater had got sick of this and saw through the crowd. We doubled to 200 by that time. Ordinary local Bridgwater people who were previously doing their shopping joined in. So this time they didn't attack, and they moved off to the King Square, where they put a wreath. Brian Green, the minister, laid a wreath on the thing saying, "No more brothers' wars." That means no more wars between white countries. That's what that means. And then they went off down to Brewery Field. That was it. I think the splash wasn't even built then. It was a council office, the H block, as they used to call it appropriately. At the time, they said, "We'll build a Brewery Field in the background," where the police asked us to disperse. So we dispersed, and they were about to try to read the riot act to the loyalist crowd, and they brought a coffin with them, draped the Irish tricolour, which they read out messages of support from Ian Paisley and co. And then they burnt the tricolour to symbolise what they call the death of democracy. And then they had a guy called Dickinson, not Bruce Dickinson, who was Iron Maiden, wasn't he? Dickinson, who was from Northern Ireland, Belfast Mayor, came over and did some talking as well. And then they buggered off. And that was the entire day. It took a few years later for the whole Friends of British Ulster, whole Anglo-Irish thing to sort of die down. The Protestant level of resistance in Northern Ireland basically crushed the Anglo-Irish agreements for another 10, 15 years when they eventually got the Dublin and the Good Friday agreements, which made it a lot better, as you see, than it was in them days. I think that's probably as much as I can remember about it. Dave mentioned it in his book. I didn't expect it to be anywhere ever again. Mentioned this whole incident. They were going to do another one in South Devon, weren't they? Because it was in a couple of years later at Torbay, because of the William of Orange centenary, maybe. And they asked us down for advice on how to deal with that. Not the William of Orange rebellion, but the they tried the same thing down there. Yeah. So that was, I think, about that. So that's about what I've got to say. Cheers.
Incredible how you can find such a tragic and dreadful story and make it light-hearted and amusing. So obviously very, very serious points behind that as well, Brian, but thank you very much indeed. It made it much more listenable, so thank you. Well, I am going to come to you now, Glen, for the second time. All right. Okay. So over to you. Thank you.
about chronological order. It's a really simple concept.
I know, I'm sorry.
Something
Yeah.
happened in 1983, you do it first. What I'm going to talk about happened 1989 to 90, so that's why I'm last, not because I've got anything more important to say. But I am going to talk about the poll tax revolt, which I think is a very, very important part of our history, and there are people in this room that certainly took part in what happened in Bridgwater. I was a district councillor at the time, from 1987 to 90, on Sedmore District Council, so right in the middle. I was also one of the organisers of the Bridgwater Anti-Poll Tax Union, and I was also obviously a non-payer of the poll tax, because that was the whole principle of the campaign. Let me just remind you, civil disobedience brought down a Prime Minister. How's that for food for thought for today? Because that's what happened. If you look in the history books now, you look in the sort of Wikipedia entries about why Thatcher resigned, and it doesn't even mention the poll tax. We've always got to be aware of this suppression of what really happens. I mean, I think history is, excuse the word, bollocks, because it kind of goes, you know, people make it up as they go along. And if you didn't know about the poll tax, you'd think that Thatcher was persuaded to stand down by her, you know, her colleagues in the cabinet who thought maybe things were going a bit wrong. And they don't say it was a mass uprising of people of Scotland, of England and Wales that actually got rid of Thatcher. So I think it's really important to make that point first. For those of you who are too young to remember it, the community charge, as they tried to call it, was introduced in Scotland in 1989 and in England and Wales in 1990. Nobody ever used that term. The poll tax, the original poll tax, was of course introduced in 1379 in order for people to pay for the 100 Years' War. And they then left it alone. It didn't work very well. They didn't collect the money they needed for the war, but you know, Thatcher had another go in 1989. And the whole principle of the poll tax was to take the burden of rate paying away from the wealthy. Because people who lived in big houses, the rates they were paying depended on the size of the house and you know, how much wealth you got. So it was a blatant attack on the poor. It was a blatant attempt to reduce rates for the rich. So if you lived in a big mansion on your own, you paid the same poll tax as someone who lived in a council house. But of course, if you lived in a council house with your husband and your 2 grown-up children, you paid 4 poll taxes. So you paid 4 times as much as the bloke living in a mansion. And that was the unfairness, the principle that scandalised and horrified, first of all, people in Scotland and of course then people in England and Wales. It was also, of course, an attack on council spending. I mean, ever since Thatcher came to power, the national government had been reducing the amount of money that was being given to local authorities in order to make them cut services. So what the poll tax meant was that, you know, that local councils were in a bind. They either increased the poll tax or they cut services. So it was, again, an attack on local democracy. And I remember very well that when we first, and I'm saying we because Brian was there are a few other Labour councillors in the room tonight, so when I start to attack the Labour group, it's not you lot, because there was only me and Brian then, who were on the council and who were fighting against the poll tax. So I'll come to that in a minute. But you know, that was the principle of the poll tax. It was to make local councils and local services massively unpopular. So all these things were going on, and I think for me, the important thing about the poll tax, I mean, the people of Bridgwater were magnificent. We've heard that often tonight, but they were. The response was immediate from so many people. I mean, if I tell you that throughout Britain there were 1,500 anti-poll tax unions, and we had one in Bridgwater. So that's people getting together, determined not to pay the poll tax. Not because they didn't believe in local services, but because they knew it was grossly unfair, and they knew that the best way to get rid of it was to clog the system and to make it unworkable. And that's what in fact happened. The All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation was in fact the sort of the work of the militant tendency. That's another story, but I have to say about the militant tendency, I didn't have any personal affiliation, but they did try to get the Labour Party and the trade union movement on board at first. But those organisations wanted nothing to do with the campaign of civil disobedience, of non-payment of the poll tax. but the people of England and Wales and Scotland did want to have a lot to do with it, and it was the most magnificent time to be someone who believed in solidarity, in marching, in taking action, in direct action. It really was. In March 1990, Tony Benn said it was the biggest demonstration since the Chartists, and he should have known. 200,000 people marched in London. So that was the first big March 1990 demonstration just before the poll tax was introduced in England and Wales to show the government how strongly people felt, and some of us were there. So the point of the campaign, the point of the civil disobedience campaign was not to pay the poll tax so that you would have to be taken to court and the courts would become absolutely clogged with all the work that they had to do. And it was interesting. It was a really interesting process. In Scotland, 1.5 million Scots were non-payers. In England and Wales, about 10 million. That means, in order to get all those people through the courts, you've got a lot of work to do, and I'll come to the statistics in a minute. And we started in Bridgwater. What were we doing? We had weekly meetings, which is pretty incredible, really, in the pub across the road. We had weekly meetings where we organised things like Mackenzie's Friends. So some people here might remember that when someone was going to be taken to court, you had an untrained lawyer called a Mackenzie's Friend, and that person went along. And this was not about displaying legal expertise, it was about buggering up the system. It was about taking a long time. One of the most brilliant things I experienced was a local vicar, who's not here anymore, David Arnott, who was the vicar over at Sydenham, who preached a sermon in the magistrates' court. The magistrates didn't know what the hell to do, because he just went on and preached his sermon, and that was just wonderful. And a lot of us did that kind of thing as Mackenzie's Friends. We were just messing up the system. We did bailiff watches, obviously, very important too. If someone was threatened with the bailiffs, we were round to the house at the front, and bailiffs got nowhere. Certainly in this town, and I'll come again to some statistics in a minute. So that was very important, that people mustn't, had to feel supported and not threatened. So we had bailiff watches everywhere. One of the best things we did was we bricked up a bailiff's house. We heard a little village called Thruble, which some of you might have heard of. A bailiff, one of the leading organisations that were being used by Sedgemoor, lived there. So we went out there, and he was out. It's so sad. So we bricked up the front door, we bricked up the walls, and then we went into his garage and we had a mock auction and sold off all his goods. That probably sounds a bit light-hearted, and it was light-hearted, but it was just kind of, a lot of pressure was put on bailiffs. We were non-violent, the police didn't turn up. I think, did we maybe have one copy?
They didn't know where Thruble was.
That's right. Well, I didn't until the day, but it was the most magnificent expression of our... And then the other things we did were to sort of, to slow things down, as I said, to mess things up, and as I say, some of you here will remember. There was this thing called joint liability, and so one of the things about being taken to court was that you had to go to court first, because then a liability order would be granted, and that gave the council the right to pursue you, to attach your earnings, to attach your benefits, to pursue you for the money. And one little, quite naughty thing that I did, I was living with Dave at the time, and they had this thing called joint liability, which said that he was responsible for my poll tax, and I was responsible for his. And I said, well, no, he's not. I'm an independent person. And I actually have a letter here from the Community Charge Benefit Review Board. So I took the case to appeal, and I argued that just because we lived together and shared the same house and had sex together didn't make him liable for any of my income. And I remember saying to the chief executive at the time, who was in the room, what was his name? Rickards, was it? Kerry Rickards at that time? I remember saying to him, for instance, I said, if you and I got off together and I took you back to my house and we had sex together, how much of my poll tax would you become liable for? The idiocy of that argument, the idiocy of the situation, I won the case. We were not jointly liable. And that kind of, to me, mirrored the whole thing about how stupid the whole thing was, how stupid the legal system is, and how, you know, whenever we get the opportunity to take the piss out of it, we should do. So that was fine. I was not liable for him. I mean, would you want to be liable for that? So those are the kinds of things we were doing. And, you know, we were very busy. As I say, we were meeting weekly. I have to say, over the course of the poll tax debacle, of only 28% of non-payers were summoned. And this is how difficult it was to do. Only 28%. Only 22% of non-payers received liability orders, and only 9% got bailiffs. In 1997, £550 million of arrears was still there. They've not collected it. They've not been able to. And it's easy to see why from those figures, isn't it? The non-payment campaign was a magnificent success. In 2015, I didn't know this until yesterday. I have done a bit of research, you know, I'm not that anti-history. In 2015, they were all written off. All the debts were written off. And that's incredible, isn't it? So there were people who actually never had to pay the poll tax. But of course, there are people who were. I want to just pay a small tribute to a man called Ken Trumps. I know Rob knows him, I know Dave knows him. Ken died in January of this year. Ken went to prison. He lived in Bridgwater. He went to prison for non-payment of the poll tax. Wonderful man. And what is even more wonderful is that when he was before he was sent to prison and his case was being heard, he was asked whether he had enough money to pay, and he told the magistrate, "Yes, I have, but I'm going to spend it on a holiday for me and my wife." So he was sent to prison. But good old Ken, well done, Ken. Involved in this, because Brian had just, I think you joined the Lake Council about 1990, didn't you? So you were there right at the beginning of this. Nationally and locally, I mean, our catchphrases in the non-payment were can't pay, won't pay. There were those who couldn't pay and there were those who wouldn't pay. And it's better to break the law than break the poor. And those were our catchphrases. I have to say, for the Labour Party, it was pay your poll tax and vote Labour. And you know, I'm sorry to say this, for me it was, you know, it brought about total disillusionment, even though I'm a member of the Labour Party again. But the Labour Party didn't just sit on the sidelines, it attacked the non-payment campaign. Neil Kinnock called us Toy Town revolutionaries. Now, he would know about Toy Town anyway, probably not about revolutionaries. The Labour Party, you know, suspended people for being part of the non-payment campaign. But they sat on the sidelines, as did the TUC. Not all of the unions, but the official trade union movement sat on the sidelines. So again, it was a very illuminating time for me, because I wasn't particularly naive, but looking back I must have been pretty naive to think that at a time when working people was so much under attack, the Labour Party and the trade union movement would come to their side. But they didn't. They said, pay your poll tax, and then when the time comes, vote Labour. And that is not good enough. And I've never forgotten that. I remember that I put a motion, I'm not waving my finger too much.
He's agreeing with you, love.
I remember that as a councillor, I put a motion to the council, which I thought was a reasonable one, saying that Central District Council would not put into prison anyone who failed to pay the poll tax because they were unemployed, disabled, elderly. Brian seconded it. We got not a single vote in support, Brian, did we? Not a single member of the Labour group, never mind the Conservatives, and only a small Labour group supported that. In other words, Labour councils throughout the country implemented the poll tax, sent people to prison for non-payment. Labour councils. There were more Labour councils in the country now, more councils were run by Labour than the Conservatives. They complied with the poll tax. They wanted to appear to be reasonable in punishing people for this appalling piece of legislation, which was only designed to destroy working class people, to attack the poor. And you know, I mean, that was such an awakening for me. I wasn't particularly young, but compared to what I am now, I was. And it was a massive wake up for me. Quite an interesting thing as well, I think, that I hadn't thought about much for me, was that in 1989, 85,000 people left the electoral register, because that was their means of thinking they could avoid payment. they've probably not gone back. Because one of the major problems we've got with elections today is low registration. It's not just people not voting, it's people not registering to vote. And it's very interesting that that was the first tactic that people thought of. They weren't told to do it by the anti-poll tax federations, but it was a tactic that people worked out for themselves that they could disappear, you know, if they did that. But Fire Brigades Union, I'm glad to say, Pete, NALGO, National Communications Union, Post Office Engineers, and the NUJ at their conferences supported non-payment. They were the only unions to do that. But I have to say, and there were lots of unofficial actions. Postmen in North London refused to deliver poll tax bills. So there were sporadic attempts of support. But, you know, the anti-poll tax campaign was run by people, ordinary people. Solidarity, people coming together, supporting each other, can't pay, won't pay. And it was a massive lesson to me that solidarity, civil disobedience and direct action are a vital part of our struggle. The Labour Party has yet to be, but you know, I'll end there.
Yeah.
Dave's already mentioned the Clarion. That's us at Never Trouble, bricking up the bailiffs.
What a way to end, eh? The Labour Party struggling for credibility in Okay.